Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing fine today. In today's video, I'm gonna go over what if the Nintendo 64 used CDs instead of cartridges. Before I start, an alternative history of Europe, Era of Kaiserreich, episode 3 will come out soon. This video is just for the meantime. So, let's go. First, we need to go over some context. The Nintendo 64 started development in around 1993, with Nintendo partnering up with Silicon Graphics to produce the Nintendo 64, and it was released in 1996. The Nintendo 64 was a little late to the market due to Sony and Sega having a year's head start with the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. But in the end of the 5th generation of consoles, Sony won with 102.49 million units. Nintendo came in second with 32.93 million units, and Sega came in last with 17 million units. One of the main reasons why Nintendo didn't perform that well was the Nintendo 64's use of cartridges. Nintendo decided to have their games be on cartridges instead of on CDs. Nintendo made the decision to use cartridges because it would make the Nintendo 64 cheaper to produce and harder for people to pirate the games. This didn't seem to bother Nintendo, but it did bother its third-party developers, and it caused a problem. You had to buy the cartridges directly from Nintendo, and with the high price for the cartridges, made many developers angry. Also, the memory on the cartridges was limited to only 64 megabytes, but for a CD at the time, it was 600 megabytes. And this was a no-brainer for them. So many third-party developers for Nintendo decided to have their games be on the PlayStation 1 instead of the Nintendo 64. And including one of those developers was Square. Square was one of Nintendo's top third parties who made the Final Fantasy series. And when they decided to put their games on the PlayStation, that hurt Nintendo 64 sales. Nintendo did have a disc system, but it was exclusive for Japan, and it was released in around 1999, around the end of the 5th generation of consoles. And it was a failure that it was discontinued when the GameCube came out. So that's it. Context over. So first, we're going to change Nintendo's mindset. Instead of them thinking on how the cartridges can do things, they will instead decide to think more about the CDs. We don't know how they will change to it, but in this video, they just do. So Nintendo in 1993 is working with Silicon Graphics to make the Nintendo 64. Nintendo uses the power of the Nintendo 64 and the CD storage to make the Ultimate Nintendo Machine, or the Ultimate Nintendo Machine for that time. Even though the loading time for the Nintendo 64 might be slow and it would be easy to pirate the games, I'd figure maybe Nintendo could make a system that could block pirated games. The Nintendo 64 would cost a lot more to produce, but would probably go down if the production costs got lowered. The games would be larger and more content could be added to those games. And one game that could really benefit from the extra storage would be Super Mario 64. Super Mario 64 is a great game, and it influenced how 3D games work today. But during the production of the Nintendo 64, Mario 64 was being worked on alongside it. And because of the limitations of the cartridge, many ideas were cut out in the final build. One of these ideas was the inclusion of a multiplayer co-op. One player played as Mario and the second player played as Luigi. But in an interview with Miyamoto, he stated, "Well, until February, he was in the game. Ultimately, due to memory issues, we had to take him out." But because of this alternative decision, the multiplayer co-op is still in the game. Certain levels were either scrapped or forced to fit within the memory constraints, but because of the CD's storage, the levels scrapped or forced within limits can have it all in. This would make Super Mario 64 huge. So, as I said, many third-party developers left Nintendo for Sony because of the PlayStation's use of CDs. But in my personal opinion, I wouldn't see this happen. Yes, the Nintendo 64 would have come out in 1996, but if Nintendo decided to show a short preview of their power for the Nintendo 64 and the disc storage, then it's a possibility that many third-party developers would look at the 64-bit power of the Nintendo 64 and look at the 32-bit power of the PlayStation. They might decide to wait for the Nintendo 64. And especially Square would see the potential and go for it. In our timeline, Final Fantasy VII would release on the PlayStation 1 and would be an instant success. This hurt Nintendo 64 sales. But because of Square's decision to publish it on the Nintendo 64, this would hurt PlayStation sales. The price of the Nintendo 64 in our timeline was $199.99 at launch. The same for the PlayStation 1 and Sega Saturn. But in my opinion on what the price for the Nintendo 64 if it had CDs, it would probably stay the same in this timeline because it was in direct competition with the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. It could probably be priced a little higher, but it was in direct competition. The video games would probably, in my opinion, cost a little bit cheaper because the discs were easy to mass produce and the games had a lot more content due to the extra space. By the end of the Nintendo 64's life, we could see that Nintendo has possibly sold more units than Sony. Sega could have probably sold more units than Sony, but that's highly unlikely due to the price of the Sega Saturn at the time. The one main reason why the PlayStation succeeded in our timeline was because Sony produced the consoles and depended on the third-party developers to make the games. But because of Nintendo's decision to use CDs, most third-party developers wouldn't have gone with the PlayStation 1, but instead with the more powerful console, the Nintendo 64. Thank you all for watching this video. This video took me a lot of time to make, and I had to do research for this video. If you have a question or a request, please comment down below, and I would really appreciate it if you guys would subscribe to show your support for the channel. Thank you, and have a nice day.